Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Sempervirens Fund. Thank you for joining us for another of our Under the Redwoods webinar series in which we explore the beauty, the history, the science, the artistry, all things redwoods. And thank you to Sharp Investments, who has been the long-term sponsor of this webinar series. We appreciate their support. So with that, I'm pleased to be joined by Maya Elson. She's a teacher, a naturalist, a mycologist, and an organizer, and she is the Mycelial Solutions Project Lead at UC Santa Cruz, our favorite slugs university. And Sempervirens is involved in hosting some of her research on fungus at our San Vicente Redwoods property, which is fantastic. She also leads mycopsychology experiences in the region, and you can check out her website, which is in the chat below, if you would like to learn more. So with that, please join me in welcoming Maya Elson. Maya. There we go.
Hello.
Welcome.
Just getting the share screen all situated. Hello.
Beautiful.
Thank you all so much for having me. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here. And thank you to everyone at Sempervirens Fund for not just for this, but for all of the incredible work that you all do. I feel like what I'm going to be talking about today is so deeply supported by the work that Sempervirens Fund does. And I'm just so excited to see this organization, as well as so many other organizations lately, starting to understand on such a deeper level the importance of fungi in conservation efforts. You know, if our goal is to protect redwood trees, we also need to be thinking about the fungi that they live with. And to really expand our tool of resources, our tools and our resources that we have for our conservation goals. So I'm just so pleased to be here with you all. I'm going to be talking about my favorite topics around fire and water and fungi and how they all interact. And really where I'm coming from here is I'm trying to, humble myself. I'm going to share some scientific knowledge, but I want to also mention that even with all of the scientific understandings, as well as the traditional ecological knowledge from this area, we're still just on the very beginning, the Eiffel tip, if you will, of understanding the incredible complexities of all of these different organisms and how they interact. We know more about outer space than we do about our soil. I want to come from a place of not necessarily like, how can the fungi serve us, and assuming that we always know the best thing to do, but how can we support the fungi in fulfilling their important ecological roles and increasing overall ecological wellness throughout our ecosystem. So I've got a little picture here of one of my favorite little fungal friends. This is the Geopixis deceptiva, a little orange cup mushroom. And I just think they're beautiful. They come out after a fire. This was taken at the San Vicente Redwoods property, which Sempervirens helps to manage. And I just think they look a lot like flames. And then when you blow on them, they release all of their spores and it looks like smoke. So I'm so tickled by these guys, and I hope that we can use them as a portal of connection to these the incredible world of fungi. So I know that some of you may already know some of this. I'm just going to give a quick rundown of basic fungal biology because I am going to be using these terms throughout the lecture, and it'll be a lot easier to understand what I'm talking about if you understand these terms. So when we find a mushroom in the forest, that is the fruiting body. It is the genitalia, if you will, of an organism. Fungi are not plants. They're more like animals than they are like plants. And most of the action, most of their body is in this filamentous network that we call mycelium, which can run through various different, what we call substrates. Substrates are a habitat and a food source at the same time. Most fungi do not produce a mushroom that you can see and pick. We call these, the ones that produce mushrooms, we call macrofungi. Only 12% of all fungi produce a fruiting body. So that has also limited our understanding of these guys. We have fungi that grow on woody debris where their substrate is a leaf or a log. For example, these we call saprotrophic fungi, the decomposers. And what's happening here is the mycelium releases enzymes that break apart hydrocarbon molecules, so like the little bonds between the hydrogen and the carbon. Some of these saprotrophic fungi get a little excited about decomposition and they start doing it before a plant has died. We call these parasitic or pathogenic fungi, and I'm going to be mentioning these. Fast forward, but they're not all bad. They have a role to play as well, and they're keeping things in balance just like everything else. We have mycorrhizal fungi. So myco meaning fungal, rhizal meaning root. And what's happening here is the mycelium of the organism connects to the root system of a plant and expands that plant's root system, giving it more access to water and minerals than the plant would be able to get on their own. In exchange, the plant provides glucose that it makes through photosynthesis. We also have these other types of fungi that I'm not going to be talking about as much as I would love to, but we're short on time. There are endophytic fungi, which grow within plant tissues and play really important roles in helping with nutrient uptake, nitrogen fixation, and protection against pathogens for plants. And we also have lichens, which are a symbiotic relationship between one or more fungi and algae or cyanobacteria. And there are lots of interesting studies coming out recently around how fire impacts lichens that I'm not going to be talking about. So what is going on right now in our forests? See this picture on the left? We have a lot of these forests that have a buildup of woody debris. That's all food for those saprotrophic fungi. We also have a lot of sudden oak death. We have a lot of trees that are really struggling and to survive and are being attacked because of their weakened state, because of the way that these different diseases work. We have fungi that are taking advantage of the weakened state of the trees and the lack of fire that has caused that and are killing many of our trees, which leads to even more flammability. And then, so we then experience intense or catastrophic wildfires, right? We're in an ecosystem that evolved with fire for thousands of years, but why are we seeing fires with this kind of intensity? This picture was taken at the top of a mountain in Last Chance, where I had this 360 view all around. I could see a bunch of big basin, I could see all sorts of stuff. And every square inch of what I could see had been completely burnt to a crisp. So this is not a healthy fire. And in these kinds of fires, the redwoods come back, but the oaks, as much as they usually love a healthy, good fire, they will die if there's a severe fire. So it's also important to understand that while we're having an increase in these saprotrophic and pathogenic fungi in our forests, we're also seeing a decrease in the mycorrhizal fungi. And the two things I think are very related. The health of our forests and the mycorrhizal fungi are very much related. So how did we get here? Many of you will know that, beginning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a booming logging industry, which has continued to this day. We've lost about 95% of our old growth redwood forests here in California. And important to keep in mind that only 75% of those forests currently have protections, and old growth is still threatened in many parts of the state. What happens when you cut down the partner of a mycorrhizal fungus is the fungi lose that important food source, that their source of sugar. And so they die back, and those forests will regenerate, but because of that dieback of the microbial community, not just the fungi, but the other microbes as well, what tends to grow back is not as healthy. And what's not as healthy is not as resilient to fire. It also tends to be more crowded and spindly rather than having, these widely separated giant trees with branches way up high. You have all of these crowded trees with branches down low that can take a fire from being a low healthy fire to a canopy fire much more quickly. We've also experienced this history and current settlement of non-Indigenous folks and of genocide and ecocide. I appreciated the land acknowledgement at the beginning, so I don't have to repeat it, but I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of these ecological problems, the fires and the floods, the most of the problems that we're dealing with is related to this history of colonization, to this extermination of humans, which play a really important ecological role in caring for these ecosystems. And they were even using fire to tend to the land in a way that they knew was going to encourage fungal growth and beneficial fungi, edible fungi, chanterelles, porcinis, these wonderful mycorrhizal fungi that thrive in the oak woodlands were there because of the indigenous folks that were taking care of the land in this way. We also now have a much higher population in our wild urban interface than there was before. So we have homes in areas that are prone to fire and are part of a fire ecology. So we need to keep this in mind. We also have this history of fire suppression and fire being demonized as this bad thing rather than a healthy and I would argue essential component of our ecological health here. So after a fire, we encounter all of these different issues. We've got loss of homes and habitat and wildlife, of course, right? Especially after a catastrophic fire. We have the threat of mudslides and erosion. We often have toxins that are released into the environment. This picture here is of a home that burned in the CZU, which is right above a sensitive waterway that this was in Last Chance Creek, but we did a lot of work actually on San Vicente Creek, really close to the San Vicente Redwoods property. But all over Santa Cruz in these steep slopes above these really important waterways, we were really scared about all of the toxins from the burned out homes entering those waterways. There's also nutrient flow that can head downwards and be problematic. There's, of course, smoke and air pollution. And then there's this phenomenon of hydrophobic soil. So essentially, it's partly because of the dieback of microbes and the top layer of soil, especially if you have a really hot fire that burns so hot it goes down into the soil, as well as the waxes that are produced from plants as they burn. It is important to keep in mind, though, that we don't lose our soil microbial communities. People thought, oh my God, this place is so roasted. There's no way that anything could survive. And of course, it does have an impact on the soil, but we do see a lot of regeneration afterwards. And that's one of the really important roles of fungi, is to support that regeneration after a fire. We start to see mushrooms like these morels or like that geopixis, that orange cut mushroom that I showed you at the beginning. And these guys are the kind of the kickstarters of that regeneration process. Sometimes they're some of the first organisms to come back in full force after a fire. And they attract insects, which attract birds, which will poop out seeds. And they just nourish this hungry and transformed landscape. We also have fungi, those mycorrhizal fungi that are going to be able to often survive because they're way deep down in the soil sometimes and can encourage the regeneration of plants after a fire, as well as holding on to a lot of water. And that's a really important thing that fungi do. So think about, we're in this Mediterranean climate right here where it's dry for half the year. And so how many plants, would die out if they didn't have those mycorrhizal fungi helping them access water during that dry season? We also have these saprotrophic fungi, which are going to be able to break down that excess woody debris after a fire or before a fire. One way to think about it is, fungi do the decomposition during the wet season and fire does it during the dry season, right? And we also have saprotrophic fungi that are adapted to breaking down wood that's already burned. And we see some really cool, that we see this one that looks just like a charred black surface that grows all over the burn scars. Cool stuff. So in terms of these saprotrophic fungi, I mean, a lot of this, remediation. So I use the umbrella term myco-renewal to describe any type of ecological regeneration that's encouraged by fungi. A lot of this is just happening naturally. And the question is always, where do we as humans intervene in this process? Um, and one of the places where I think it's really important for us to intervene is to protect sensitive waterways from those toxins. So this is a home that burned in Boulder Creek in the CZU. And I worked with a number of different community groups, and it was just amazing to see the way that that our community came together after the fire, to be able to protect our waterways and our ecosystem. And we installed these inoculated wattles. So you see this brown thing in front, that's called a wattle or a filter sock. And now we have a machine where we can inoculate the wattles as we're making them rather than afterwards, which is far more ideal for a lot of reasons. And what this does is, by introducing a native fungi right after the fire, instead of waiting for it to get there naturally, which it would, and a lot of the reason that these are so effective as a technology is they're just making habitat for native fungi to do their thing. So there's not, you don't always have to intervene. But in a situation like this, if we can introduce these beneficial fungi, we can help stabilize the soil and biodegrade those toxins before they run down into those waterways. So this was a part of a project called the Post-Fire Biofiltration Initiative, which was a part of the Post-Fire Watershed Defense Coalition. And we had a study that was not just in the CZU, but also in 4 other burn scars from the Central California fires in 2020. I think many of us remember that, who were here during that year. It's kind of stuck in our heads. So this work has also led to other communities affected by fire who are really interested in using these same kinds of methodologies. I've been involved with one of these groups called Maui Bioremediation Group, which is looking to create fungal inoculated filter socks. They call them filter socks instead of wattles there because wattles are an invasive plant. And as well as inoculated logs to protect the sensitive marine ecosystem after the fires in Lahaina. And this picture here was when I was in Kula, where we were doing that, that type of work. They're also doing liquid biological soil amendments. They're looking at solid microbial amendments. They're doing phytoremediation. They're just doing all sorts of amazing projects down there right now, and are really leading the way for communities in future fires to be able to respond appropriately. So then we've got the role of fungi post-fire for ecological regeneration. It's been a really interesting ongoing conversation with a lot of people about, like, where do we intervene, where do we not? And this picture in the top left, you can see, a spotty fire. This is from the CZU, where we had we had some areas that burned really hot, and then we had some areas that didn't burn hot. We actually had some areas where the oak trees were thrilled, where it was like this healthy fire, We also, if you've been back there, you can see that it's regenerating quite beautifully in some areas, and less beautifully by our standards, whatever they are, in other areas. So, spores will fly in from nearby places that didn't burn. Seeds will will come back. There's not always a place for humans to intervene. This picture down at the bottom, though, that's at Sequoia National Park, where we have a fire-adapted tree species, a species that relies heavily on fire for its health and its dispersal, die in large numbers from a fire that just burned so hot. And these are the kind of areas that I feel concerned about. I also feel concerned about areas like the August Complex fire, places like the Camp Fire, where it burned for hundreds of miles, and you don't have birds, dropping seeds because the birds have died. You don't have spores coming back in because everything got so toasted. So these are the places where I'm really interested in introducing native beneficial fungi to kind of speed up that ecological regeneration process and also help those areas adapt to a hotter, drier climate at the same time. I'm also concerned about areas, where fire is going to affect the sensitive waterways because we all love our frogs and our salmon and all of the aquatic species that we've got. So those areas where those waterways are impacted are where I think humans have an important job to do. Wanted to give a brief rundown. There's a wonderful study that kind of kickstarted this whole project for me in a lot of ways. Was Dr. Mia Maltz's research on mycorrhizal fungal spores to support ecological regeneration. So all of that work, along with the post-fire biofiltration initiative, we built on all that we'd started there, and now we're in the last year of a 3-year study that's looking at ways that we can both do toxin mitigation and support ecological regeneration post-fire, as well as sequester carbon, because carbon and preventing climate change is a big piece of the puzzle that needs to be integrated in the methodologies that we use and that we develop. And this study has led to a small study that I'm leading with folks at the one at San Vicente Redwoods with UCSC students, where we're creating these things that I call biologs, which are inoculated logs that can be used as a fuels treatment and as a way to support ecological regeneration post-fire. So what's happening here is we take these logs that or down trees or standing trees that are going to be added to that forest fuel, because you can have this vicious cycle, right? Where like a fire burns, bunch of dead standing wood is around afterwards, another fire comes, and then it burns even more intense because of that, right? So there's a huge need. And even on the federal level, a recognition of the importance of managing what we call forest fuels in order to prevent catastrophic wildfires. So what we're doing is we're inoculating these logs with fungi and partially burying them. And this one you can see was done with a wattle right next to it. And I think that combo is so key, especially, this one was right above San Vicente Creek and below a burned down home, where it felt especially important to have that double barrier. Why are we doing this? Why am I so excited about inoculating logs? Well, they hold on to 25 times more moisture than bare soil does. And then when they're partially buried, there's even more water retention that happens. They return valuable nutrients to the forest. We're keeping the carbon on the land that it came from instead of shipping it away or incinerating it. This helps to establish communities of beneficial microbes and fewer pathogens. I like that it can be integrated with lots of other fuels treatments, particularly with biochar production, which is a whole other topic. If you want to ask me, I can go into it. But for time's sake, I'm going to hold off. And the other thing that I'm really excited is I really want to create an alternative to logging post-fire. Post-fire salvage logging has been so misused, and there are so many forest ecosystems that have just been devastated by people saying that you need to log these forests post-fire. As well as biomass incineration, which when it's not done well, can have a really high ecological impact and human health impact as well. So as we're, asking all of these big questions of, how do we enmesh with the mycelial network to make the world better, I think it's important that we address some of the historic wounds as well as the current wounds of what's going on. And we stand on this crux where I see us having such an opportunity to support the new growth, a new way of being, a new way of interacting with our ecosystem, not one of, oh, we know all the best things to do, but one of using the traditional ecological knowledge that people are, in the mainstream management world are finally starting to take very seriously, as well as these incredible advancements in scientific technology, especially some of the advancements in genetic sequencing that can be really helpful for understanding these microbial communities. And coming together in that way of integrating, indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge in a way that we can really set our future descendants up for success. So I guess I'll leave it at that. There's so much more that I would love to share, but I think I'm out of time. Um, Sarah, I believe you have some questions.
I do. Oop, I'm having trouble with my video. Thank you.
And
That
I'll
was so interesting. I've lots of questions for you, but just maybe to build off that last set of remarks about sort of the human fungi relationship. Um, and sempervirens and others in the conservation world have been thinking a lot about that dynamic and different understanding of humans' role in nature, in particular, as we've both talked about, the lessons learned from some of our in the predecessors in indigenous communities who very actively managed our forests, for example. And I'm just curious, as the science of mycology grows, where do you hope or think that the human relationship with fungi is going to evolve to? And do we know anything about what it was? You mentioned that indigenous communities had been actively sort of cultivating particular fungi, but is there more we know about that historical relationship and what you think we should be aiming to get to going forward?
yeah, there's a really surprising lack of information. I mean, that there's no known descendants of the Awaswa speaking Yubi tribe here. So, there's 15,000 years of how to live on this land that we've lost.
Yeah,
Um, and what we do have, though, is some information from other parts of California. There's a great piece, maybe Matt can put it in the chat for us. If you look up California ethnomycology by Frank Lake and MCAT Anderson, that has a lot of really helpful information that I think any forest manager should look at. There's some big gaps in the knowledge, even with that. So I think that, what I've gathered is that, a lot of this tending to the oak woodland with fire was also a part of creating these kind of open meadows, not just for camas, good foraging for deer, perhaps for basketry and berries, but also because fungal species are so abundant in those places.
yeah,
So in places where we can't do that kind of, where we can't have prescribed or cultural burning, I think that doing any kind of fire mimicry, doing things similar to the way, a fire would move through the land, can be really helpful. Yeah, there's some cool stuff that Sudden Oak Life is an organization that is a little controversial, but has been doing a lot of really cool weaving together of best available science and indigenous knowledge and developing these methodologies for fire mimicry on the land.
I
Yeah.
finish
Well,
your
I would
thought.
just say the piece that's often missing, though, with all of this is how does microbial inoculation fit in? And how can we know that we can inoculate oak trees and it helps them out for a little while, but how do we set them up for success and how do we make sure that we're inoculating with the fungi that are best adapted, not just for right now, but for the future?
Yeah. Well, so that gets to my next question, which is, in thinking about this, as I've spoken with you and read some of your materials that you've shared with us, it really strikes me that in many ways, the way conservationists should think about fungi is analogous to how we think about any species in the forest or elsewhere on the landscape. We look to see what's threatening them. We monitor them to see how their populations are doing. We use various indicators to understand how healthy individuals or the population of a species are. And we're aware that there are threats to those, like non-native species, for example. And I just wonder, in the world of fungus, is there enough knowledge for us to know what are the indicators of a healthy set of fungal populations? What would as I look at, for example, our property, San Vicente Redwoods, Do we know if the fungal populations there are appropriately diverse? Are we missing some key fungi species that historically would have been there? Do we know enough to do that kind of assessment and determine whether our fungal populations are healthy?
Yeah, I'm gonna avoid trying to get myself in trouble here because there's a lot of controversy around the concept of invasive fungi. And you'll talk to different people in the mycology world with wildly different opinions and beliefs around it.
About
Um,
whether there is anything that is considered
yeah,
invasive versus
and
just,
then
yeah,
and then regardless of what our opinions are, is there anything we can even do about it?
yeah, right, right,
Right? I mean, I think create because it's not like pulling Scotch broom where you okay, you make sure we don't, spread the seeds and we pull up the body of it and we get it
right.
out. Fungi, the mycelium is there. The
You
spores are
cannot
going to get out.
expect it,
Yeah, and so unless you're using a bunch of toxic, stuff that's just going to probably kill off the beneficial fungi that you do want that are competing with your pathogenic fungi. I mean, there's really so little that we can do. I think all these things of like bringing good fire back to the land and, restoring ecological balance and keeping the water, there and making sure we have aerobic soils rather than anaerobic soils and, making sure that the water can move through properly. All of these things are going to set us up for success and reduce the problems that we might have with pathogenic or invasive species of fungi. Um, and, so there are current studies that are going on right now around invasive fungi. Um, there's it's interesting right now we're having a lot of the death cap becoming is starting to be called an invasive fungi,
yep,
spreading around the world. And so that is one to watch out for, especially if you're a forager. It can look really similar to some of our delicious edibles and
yep,
taste similar as well. Um, so that's one to really keep an eye out. What I see more are these like native invasive fungi, so ones that are in overabundance, and a lot of them are just trying to fill the hole because there's no fire. So they're like, oh, extra woody debris, we know how to deal with that.
right.
Um, yeah, so it's
An
it's tricky.
ecological niche.
Yeah.
Well,
So yeah,
how should we as a land trust that is both stewarding a lot of property that we own and or involved in policy discussions with regard to lands that public agencies or others own, um, how should we be considering fungi in our approach to conservation? I mean, obviously you gave us some really wonderful examples of post-fire recovery, how it could be used to sort of I interpreted your inoculation stories to sort of reboost the fungal populations in key strategic locations within the forest after a fire, almost like if you've taken an antibiotic and you want to eat yogurt
exactly.
after you afterwards to
Totally.
restore your gut biome. It felt a lot like that. But
Yeah.
are there other ways that our organization as a land manager and or attempting to influence others' land management practices should be incorporating knowledge of fungi? Or is it more just something to be aware of the key role, but our ability to manage it is actually quite limited?
Yeah, well, I think it's both. Absolutely. There's, one area where I'd love to see more expansion is in the world of we didn't talk a lot about floods yet. So I just want to also
Yeah,
remind us that these fungal hyphae hold on to the soil. And mycorrhizal fungi create a substance called glomalin, that is like literally the glue that holds the hillsides together. And so when those rains get pounded, if that glomalin is there, if those mycorrhizal networks are there, you're not going to have the same amount of debris flow and mudslides, right?
that's
Um,
interesting. So you could
yeah,
imagine using these inoculation wattles for on denuded steep slopes as a way of rebuilding the resilience of those slopes, not necessarily from the standpoint of keeping toxins out, although it would probably do that as well, but playing a
yeah,
really positive green infrastructure kind of role.
absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to work with organizations more that are doing, stream restoration and river restoration, and figuring out how best we can apply these in that context. And that said, I think something else to keep in mind if we're applying these organisms is that they don't work alone. You know, it's not about like, oh, we just throw our oyster mushroom at it, bada bing, bada boom. You know,
Yeah,
it's
all set.
all set. And sometimes, you know, just like getting a key fungus in there, I think for bioremediation, you know, like of a specific toxin in a specific place, like there's a role for single species inoculation. But general, you know, in general, we want to be able to make sure that we've got the whole soil food web, which includes bacteria and protozoa, as well as the fungi and macroinvertebrates, you know, like what's the role of insects in all of this, right?
So
So,
can you say more about what it looks like in the
yeah.
context of a riverside, how the fungus would engage in a riparian context? Because we are paying increasing attention, not that we ignored it previously, but we are spending a lot more time thinking about watersheds, and this audience has heard about folks advocating for the slow water movement and
Mm.
recommending reintroduction of beaver and a whole variety of different approaches. And I'm just curious how you see the role that fungus can play in that context in a riparian. Is it primarily through this issue of helping the soil remain less erosive and more intact, or are there other ways as well?
Well, there are, it is, yes, it is that of holding onto the soils and keeping it intact, as well as you can make mycofilters, you know, which are going to help to kill off a lot of the E. coli and cryptosporidium and some of these pathogenic bacteria that we have to reckon with, especially here in the San Lorenzo watershed,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Got quite a lot of that.
And so that would
So
be something that would be beneficial, not just post fire, but at any point, as long as the watershed remains in a degraded condition.
yeah, absolutely. I would say that there's no harm in it. And a lot of our, you know, restoration projects already introduce a lot of biomass, already introduce a lot of plants. So by proxy, you're also creating a good situation for the fungi to do their thing, whether or not you did it intentionally. Um, a lot of these can dovetail really nicely with existing practices.
Mhm. Are there other practices? You've talked a bit about the soil, which we don't, I mean, I think we're aware of. It's not like our conservation ecology team has ignored it entirely, but we don't manage much for soil. And I'm curious, are there other things you think we should be doing or other indicators of soil health that we should be monitoring more closely on our properties?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm really excited about doing these soil microbial community composition analyses. So what that does, it looks at the entire soil food web, you know, how many protozoa do we have? And it doesn't always get things right down to species, but at least to genera. So just to have that big picture understanding of who's doing what in your soil at each of at the properties that you manage can really inform these management decisions, especially if you're comparing, you know, like, okay, so especially if you're comparing before and after a disturbance, you know, so if there's a experimental restoration, a project that's going on, you know, you could look at that community composition, microbial community composition before and after as an indicator of its efficacy. And then you can, you know, also be measuring plant health with it, you know, of like, okay, so do we have, you know, just a bunch of invasive grasses coming right now, or are we getting the kind of healthy tree growth that we want? Or moisture content too is also going to be a major indicator of microbial health and is a little bit cheaper to check for. So,
Great.
yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I think my 11-year-old son, traditionally when we go out on hikes and he sees fungi, he's a big kicker of fungus. He thinks it's hilarious. And I think from now on, I'm going to tell him he needs to knock it off with my newfound appreciation of the role these um, fungi are playing in the forests. So,
Oh, well,
um,
you can always pick them and walk them around. They love that. They love getting high up where they can spread their spores.
well, so maybe his kicking is doing some good.
Yeah,
Some good.
depends on how
Maybe
far he kicks them.
he's a fungi pollinator. All right, well, with that, I'm gonna invite my colleague, Matt, to let us know what kind of questions we've gotten from the audience.
Great, thanks,
Well,
Sarah.
thank you. This has been terrific, and there are a lot of questions. There were several about, you mentioned biochar, and so I'm going to summarize the questions and ask if you could explain a little bit more about what biochar is, um, its role, and whether inoculating biochar with fungi is a helpful strategy.
I love this question. Thank you for the excuse to talk about biochar. I actually had a slide about it that I cut because I didn't think I was going to have enough time. So I'm actually going to go ahead and share screen again, if that's okay.
Yep.
And show you guys my slide, my brand new slide that no one else has seen yet. Can you all see that? Great. So biochar has it has a broad way of there's a lot of different methodologies for making it, and how you make it I think is really important to keep in mind. So ideally it's made through a process called pyrolysis, which is a low oxygen combustion method where there is some carbon released, but the majority of the carbon is made in this stuff that looks like charcoal. And you see in this picture on the right, there's on a microscopic level, there's these little holes in it. And I've heard it referred to as like a microbe hotel. You know, there's lots of room in the hotel. Lots of little spots for different kinds of microorganisms, you know, fungi, beneficial fungi for one, bacteria, beneficial bacteria generally. But also watch out for the E. coli can also grow on there. So you got to keep that in mind. And
Can you explain to people what biochar is?
yes, so this is the byproduct of this combustion method of pyrolysis. So it looks like charcoal. You can see that little picture on the left. Um, and it's mostly just carbon, and it's generally pretty sterile when it starts out. So you have kind of a clean slate where you can, if you inoculate it with beneficials, you can be, bringing those in at the same time as you're sequestering carbon. Sequestering carbon being something that's like, okay, so if you never burned it in the first place and it went into the soil, decomposition also releases carbon. So the whole carbon analysis around this, there's some controversy around that, and it really depends on how hot you burn it, and how much of the byproduct of the charcoal is left. But what we've been doing at San Vicente Redwoods is we've added it with our inoculated logs, and we're using biochar that's produced on site, which is really nice. It's often used as a soil amendment for agriculture, and as a way of building structure. And one of the reasons that it works so well is that these big pockets, these like hotel rooms, right? There's a lot of oxygen in that environment. You add this to the soil, and there's more oxygen in the soil all of a sudden. Most of, pretty much across the board, beneficial microbes are aerobic, and non-beneficial pathogenic fungi or invasive microbes can thrive in anaerobic environments, areas without oxygen. So just by creating more little pockets of air in the soil, you improve the overall soil health, as well as these inoculants start to break down that carbon, they're making nutrients available to other plants in that ecosystem. So I think it has a lot of potential. It can totally be misused, but I'd love to explore this further.
What is the
Thank
impact of
you.
agriculture on fungal populations?
It absolutely depends on the agriculture. Yeah, which kind of agriculture? There's,
Sounds like it's a longer answer. I just realized I hadn't thought about it, but I'll let Matt go back to the
yeah,
audience.
I mean, I think it's really important for folks in the agricultural industry to incorporate fungi and beneficial microbes, and they're going to have better yields. They're going to use fewer pesticides. They're going to use less water, less overall land, more presence of wildlife, and all of the things that we want are all possible when we're integrating our agricultural systems with our natural soil microbial ecosystem.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maya.
direct.
That was very interesting. I'm really glad we had a chance to talk more about biochar. There are several questions following up on sudden oak death.
Okay.
And so a couple questions that I'll throw at you are, how extensive is SOD, sudden oak death, in the Santa Cruz Mountains? Do fungi spread the pathogen? And will the wet winter encourage that spread?
Ooh, these are very good questions. I'm going to answer as best as I can. If you're looking for more information, I would recommend checking out the sudden oak death survey that UC Berkeley does every year. That can give you more exact numbers about the range of where it is. I would encourage folks to participate in that survey. I think it's really valuable and important data that they're collecting. I've done it with my kiddo. It's like a fun little outing, you know, you go out and look at the leaves and see how many of trees in your local parks have been killed by sudden oak death. It's really depressing and fun at the same time. So sudden oak death is caused by a brown algae, not a fungus, but it acts kind of like a fungus. It weakens the tree's immune system. And then it is a lot of our native fungi actually that end up killing the tree. And leading to its decline in various ways, not necessarily outright killing it, but not helping necessarily because they're getting a little too excited. So we see a lot of this false turkey tail, which is interesting because it looks like flame. And we see these carbon balls or cramp balls, which look like burnt wood. So there's kind of this interesting, like how the fungi are mimicking fire in the way that they're dealing with a lot of this excess wood. Because of the amount of buildup of woody debris, it's able, these native invasive fungi, these false turkey tail and carbon balls, are able to spread more quickly and are leading more to the decline of these plants. There's been a number of different studies that have shown that, you know, after a fire, you have lower amounts of sudden oak death. So when people say, you know, oh, it's just this invasive problem, like, you know, it's not like Scotch broom. It's something that's a forest management problem as well. It's an ecosystemic problem that needs to be addressed, not just the individual species. And so these guys, I don't believe that they spread the brown algae as far as I know. I believe that was one of the questions. I do know that there are beautiful California bay laurel can be kind of a catalyst that can spread the sudden oak death around in the forest more. And that's another tree that can grow up really crowded after clear cut and get all up in the oak woodlands business. And so keeping it in check is also a part of addressing sudden oak death. Did that address those questions sufficiently? Did I miss something?
I thought that was terrific. And one of my colleagues just sent me a note that we have participated in that exact survey. So thank you
Oh,
for sure.
great.
I shared it in the chat for folks. We have lots of other questions, but I wanted to ask a mushroom identification question because we just did this with you as we created the fun guide to the forest. And we learned with you that there's a lot of challenge in using apps like iNaturalist to identify fungi from photos. Do you have any recommendations on other image recognition sites that more readily ID fungi and mushrooms?
Oh, I think iNaturalist is the best one. I mean, it uses the Seek technology. And also what I love about it is you're contributing to our scientific understanding of fungal populations. So I think if you're going to use an app, that would be the one. But I would start with a book. I always recommend that folks start with, for this area, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast by Noah Siegel and Christian Schwartz is a fantastic piece of work. So I would absolutely, you know, if you want to identify mushrooms, you kind of have to get that book. I'm just going to say it. And I also really like California Mushrooms as another great book. There's all sorts of, the books are really a really good place to start. And then the apps I would go to afterwards in order to check or verify your ID, or if you want to share what you found with the scientific community. Yeah. And also you could take a class with me if you'd like.
I was hoping you'd suggest that. So yeah,
I'm booked out through the end of this season. I think I might have room on March 10th. I maybe have room this Saturday. But yeah, feel free to reach out for next season if folks are interested.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, Definitely wanted to ask a redwoods question. Wondering if you could say a little bit about the mycorrhizal fungi relationship with redwoods and maybe how they, if and how they connect redwoods to other species, tree species, conifers, and other types of plants in the forest.
Yeah, I was told and believed for a long time that redwoods didn't have mycorrhizal partners, that they were getting, they were able to grow so big because they get their water from the coastal fog. I've more recently learned that they do have both arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and our ectomycorrhizal fungi. So two different groups I didn't talk about of mycorrhizal fungi. Which explains a lot about why they're able to come back so quickly after a fire. They do have these very shallow root systems, so I would imagine that they rely really heavily on their mycorrhizal partners in order to stay standing and not fall over in all the wind, as well as to survive the drought. They do also, I believe that these networks connect with tan oak in particular, and other tree species. So we've got a lot of that like tan oak redwood mixed forest. And they are able to in that mixed forest, there are these like, black trumpets and a lot of different really interesting mycorrhizal fungi that will emerge.
Matt, is that
Amazing.
it for questions?
Yeah, Sarah, I think with our time left, we just want to say thank you to Maya. This was terrific.
I have so many additional questions for you, Maya, but we don't have time for them here, but thank you. And thank you for the amazing work that you and your students from UC Santa Cruz are doing at San Vicente. You're really helping us better understand what's going on our properties, and helping us to think about how we can manage them with fungus in mind. So thank you for all that you're doing. And thank you to our audience for joining us. I definitely encourage you to check out some of the resources we posted in the chat if you want to learn more about all things fungal. And please also join us for our next webinar series in which we will meet another scientist exploring the microflora of the redwoods, in this case, a lichenologist. Maya, you referenced lichens, but we didn't get into them much today. So for this audience, you can learn more about that with Dr. Rika Rees-Naisberg, who will help us discover what these tiny critters, or I'm not sure if you call lichens critters, these organisms, the role that they play in amongst the giant trees. So thank you all for being part of this. And yeah, I hope you all come away, as I have, with a new appreciation for the fungus world that's amongst us. So thank you all. And thank you, Maya.